annual APIEL. Quick announcements, we're going to put out some more extra things for lunch like we did yesterday again for people who want to stay. About Nutella and fruit again. So we'll get that started. And I hope that all of you can stay for the afternoon sessions as well. So I'm here to introduce Tom Butler. He's the editorial projects director of the Foundation for Deep Ecology. He's also the volunteer board president of the Northeast Wilderness Trust. This is the only regional land trust in the Northeast focused exclusively on preserving forever wild landscapes. Many of you might know him as a writer or a conservation activist. He's a former editor of Wild Earth, and if you've been to any UMD event, you should know that the Plenary Appalachia book is thanks to him. So if you haven't seen it yet, you should go look at our table. It's a beautiful book with all of the pictures. And his newest book, The Energy Reader, The Overdevelopment and the Delusion of Endless Growth. We have a really big copy out there as well, and he has been so great to provide a lot of these for the first 50 people who signed up. So I'm just going to go ahead and let him start.
Who knew that it would be so much fun to hang out with a bunch of lawyers for the weekend? I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It was terrific to be in some of the sessions these last couple of days. Almost all of that was focused on policy work or legal work. All of that's down in the weeds. It's the detail work. You're going to win a case, you've got to cite the right case law, you've got to have the right tactics. You're down in the thick of the fight at the most detailed level. This is going to be completely different. I can't do that. First of all, I'm not competent to get down in the weeds with you on legal issues or even those policy matters. But I'm going to continue that organic metaphor and say what I'm going to try to do is go the opposite direction and climb a great big old, maybe an old growth tulip poplar tree and look out at the forest view. Try to look a little bit back and a little bit forward about the era of extreme energy that we've entered and the power of wildness to counter it. So I thought it might be nice for us to start out this conversation with a little bit of ancient wisdom from Lao Tzu, writing 26 centuries ago. As for those who would take the whole world to tinker with as they see fit, I observe that they never succeed. For the world is a sacred vessel, not made to be altered by man. The tinker will spoil it. Usurpers will lose it. People tell me what usurpers are. What is it to usurp? To take over how, though? It's to seize power, to make a claim on something that is illegitimate. Usurpers will lose it. The tinker will spoil it. That is the story in a nutshell of the modern human footprint on Earth. So I'm going to get this started, and we'll take a little bit of a look at some of the images from this new book that I co-edited, Energy, Overdevelopment, and the Delusion of Endless Growth. Here's a little bit of a view of how the tinkers are spoiling. Sorry about that audio problem, but if you didn't catch it, the repeating lyric in that song is, "You already know how this will end." Everybody in this room knows how this energy economy will end if it's not counted, if it's not reversed, if it's not abated. And that end is not going to be pretty for humans or nature. So my opportunity to be with you these next few minutes is to think a little bit about that intersection of the era of extreme energy and wildness, and particularly the history and the way that the social change movements in American history have been developing along a sphere of greater and expanded ethical concern. Now, the current energy economy, of course, is based on drilling platforms and pipelines and power lines, but more fundamentally it's based upon an idea. And that idea is a powerful one. It is that the world is merely a collection of resources for human use and profit. It's a really, really important idea to pay attention to, because essentially what that means is nothing is sacred. Absolutely nothing is sacred. Not the wild rivers of Patagonia, which a consortium of utilities would like to dam up and ship the power up to Santiago. Not the ancient curves and folds of this region of Appalachia, which one decapitated mountain after another becomes a national energy sacrifice zone. Not the health of our communities, or even the lungs of our children. Nothing is sacred. In the introduction to this new book, Energy, Overdevelopment, and the Delusion of Endless Growth, Richard Heinberg, who we collaborated with at the Post-Carbon Institute on the project, really sums up this idea. Richard Heinberg writes, "The essential problem is not just that we are tapping the wrong energy sources, though we are, or that we are wasteful and inefficient, though we are, but that we are overpowered, and we are overpowering nature." Now, when we see an image like this one of tar sands development in Alberta, well, the toxic nature of that current energy economy is absolutely obvious. But do you see it when you walk around through your everyday life? Do you see it in the table? Do you see it in the chair? Do you see it in the carpet? Do you see it in the lights? Everything around us uses energy. Everything that we do, all the services that we use to support our way of life, all of it depends on cheap, abundant, and perpetually available energy. And much of that infrastructure, those layers of the scaffolding of civilization, much of it's pretty well hidden from us most of the time. If we're not doing an overflight of Mingo County, but we're just flipping on the light switch in DC, we don't see it. Those systems of extraction, refining, and generation, and those transport networks, all of those have to be in place. Essentially, energy supports this entire scaffolding of civilization, and in something of a positive feedback loop, it now takes all of those systems, all that scaffolding of civilization, to keep all those systems running. It keeps the techno-industrial growth and this hyper-consumer society just humming along. And the area, the amount of the land and water that is taken up by that energy sector is gigantic. If you think about it, it's very likely that after agriculture, energy production and transport networks is the single largest land use on the planet. And that sprawling devastation is just toxic to both ecological integrity and human health. And of course, the way we generate and deploy energy resources is cooking the planet. That is so obvious to everyone here. I'm not going to belabor that point and talk much about it. The first step toward meaningful resistance to this era of extreme energy is to get sort of a clear picture, an understanding of where we are, what's the landscape, the terrain right now. And to do that, it's really helpful to have a good understanding of some energy fundamentals. So for those of you for whom this will be remedial, I apologize in advance. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes talking about energy literacy and some basic energy literacy 101. And we'll start with physics, of course, those old thermodynamic laws, one and two. Of course, energy is the basis of everything. It makes the universe go around, but it can't be destroyed, and it can't be created. It can only be transformed. And generally, in that transformation, it's always into less usable, more diffuse forms. That's the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. Anyone in the room who's past the age of 50, you know that the law of entropy applies. Absolutely. Apparently, the law of entropy also applies to well, I'm going to skip over that one. All right, net energy, absolutely crucial, fundamental idea. It takes energy to produce energy. What you get left over after that investment, the net, what's deployable for societal use, that's net energy. And everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with the idea of the wildcatter who goes out to West Texas and he scuffs his cowboy boot or something, and out comes the gusher. Well, of course, when the oil age began, the energy investment needed to get an energy return was very low. So the net energy ratio was really, really high for the sweet stuff, the sweet spots, the easy places to get to, and the very highest quality energy resources. Decades ago, in conventional oil production, it's estimated that conventional oil was more than 101. That is, the energy equivalent of 1 barrel of oil got you 100 plus back. That's been going down as the easier to get stuff has been worked through. It's for conventional oil, it's now down to about 20 to 1 and declining. Now, the predicament here, of course, is obvious that a society that has been built on super cheap, super abundant, really high net energy, fossil energy resources, when faced with a different reality, is going to have a very hard time maintaining itself. So an energy resource, of course, is not particularly helpful if it takes as much energy to get that resource and deploy it, or nearly as much. So if we think of, for instance, liquid biofuels, sugar cane-based ethanol has a positive net energy, but still very low. By some assessments, corn-based ethanol is actually a net energy loser. It makes no sense to produce it from an energy return standpoint. Oh, I'm going to go back to that. I want to go through this chart completely, but what's very clear is those fossil energy resources have a very high net energy ratio because capturing solar energy in the form of wind or solar PV is a lower net energy return because those sources are more diffuse. They're abundant, but diffuse. Energy density. Our current industrial growth society looks a lot of the way it does because of this. Fossil energy resources are miraculous. We've had this one-time windfall that nature provided to us of these extremely dense, highly portable, highly storable fossil energy fuels. And on average, coal, for instance, has about twice the same energy density as wood, and the liquid fuels derived from petroleum are about 3 times the energy density of wood. Did anybody drive here in a car today? How far did you come?
6 miles.
Okay. Could you have pushed your car here those 6 months?
Would have taken much longer.
It would have taken much longer. Now you're really fit. You're buff. I'm sure you could have done it maybe with a little bit of help from your friends. I came 10 miles in a Toyota Yaris. I would have needed several friends to push it here. But in the amount of time that, less than the time that I could drink a latte, an equivalent amount of petroleum could zip that car along here at 50 or 60 miles an hour. It's incredibly energy dense, these fossil energy resources. Embodied energy. Everything you look at, everything you touch, has required a certain amount of energy to produce it, to maintain it, and will eventually be to dispose of it. And that is embodied energy. There are ways of analyzing that. It's been done for a certain number of consumer products, and you can actually do it for other kinds of services as well. But it raises a really interesting challenge. If you're trying to audit the embodied energy in something, maybe your cell phone, well, what do you look at? You look at the rare earth elements that were mined in Africa, shipped here. Do you look at the ships that brought it? Do you look at the refining facilities? Do you look at the transport networks? Where do you stop? What about the machines that made the machines that did the refining? What about the food that served the workers that did the refining? What about the machines that grew the food that served the workers that did the refining? You know, once you start down that, you realize that the boundaries of consideration are endless. And essentially, what you're trying to do is audit the scaffolding of civilization. Still, however, it is a useful exercise if you keep your criteria for that kind of analysis constrained. You can see that some products, some services require much, much more energy than others. Just another metaphor to think about is this energy train. You pick up the cell phone, grab the smartphone, and it seems like an autonomous object. It seems like one thing. And yes, it requires some juice to plug it in tonight and get the battery recharged. That's what we think. Well, it's a thing, it requires a little bit of energy, and it requires ongoing energy to maintain it. But actually pulling this train, it's pulling a train. In each of those successive train cars, there is a retail store to buy it. There was an advertising industry to indicate desire for that new phone. There was a production plant. There were factories. There were diggers in the rare earth fields, in the mines. There was this entire transport network that got it all around. There was the packaging, and there was the manufacturing of the packaging. The train is pulling a lot of cars, and all of those cars have to be in place before the phone can make one thing. For the vast, vast majority of human history, all the work that we did was done by human muscles. Much more recently, after we started to domesticate wild animals and enslave them for our purposes, we started to use animal servants and the muscles of them, thus horsepower. But if you think about our current situation where we've been able to exploit these vast quantities of fossil energy resources, if you make the equivalent to human muscle power, you see that each of us is essentially, we are using energy slaves. And it's been estimated that based on the amount of energy per capita, the Americans have something like more than 100 energy slaves working for them around the clock. It's 1 barrel of oil is the energetic equivalent of something like 25,000 hours of human labor. Population growth. The demographer Joel Cohen has estimated that through human history, human population grew at about 1/500th of 1%. That is to say, it was incredibly stable for a very, very long period of time until the invention of agriculture. And there it ticked up by about a factor of 10. It is still a fraction of 1%. Where you start to get the upswing in this famous hockey stick graph is at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we started to tap in those highly energy-dense fossil fuel resources like coal and later oil. And since 1800, when the human population globally was about 1 billion, to now when it's 7.2 billion, we had population grow sevenfold, but energy use per capita by more than 30 times. Again, energy density. Same thing with economic growth. When human beings use their own muscles and use the animal servants' muscles, economic growth didn't occur very fast. There was some technological innovation, but it was a pretty slow thing. Since the Industrial Revolution, per capita income's risen more than 8 times in those 200 years. Peak oil. course, is the point in time when the aggregate global energy of oil production will reach its maximum and then commence a slow slide. It's the same curve you would have for any non-renewable resource. There'll be a production upswing, there'll be eventually leveling out, and after that maximum, there'll be a decline. Peak oil is an interesting thing because for several years, we heard a lot about peak oil, and then we had this fracking thing happen, and U.S. energy production started to uptick a little bit, and the PR industry really kicked in, and now it's like, wow, that peak oil stuff is so over. That's done. Still, if you look at where U.S. energy production was in 1970 and where it is now, they're still way, way below the peak of U.S. energy production, or oil production. And it appears, of course you only know where peak oil was in hindsight, but it appears that global production of conventional oil peaked in 2005. It's been awfully stable, and unconventional resources are picking up the slack, or projected to. Now, renewables are growing quickly, but world energy use is still absolutely overwhelmingly dominated by fossil fuels. Look at that oil, coal, and natural gas at 34, 28, and 24% respectively. Hydro, large hydro, big dam hydro, and nukes just below. If you look at liquid biofuels, you're at less than 2%. Solar PV, even industrial wind, very, very small parts of the total energy sector. Energy sprawl, of course. You saw those pictures, those introductory photos. All of that is sprawl. The land use, the actual area taken up by energy production, generation, and transport, of course, is very large, and it's growing, and it grows ever faster when you have less energy-dense fuels to explore. So, in terms of area affected, an underground coal mine may have a fairly small energy footprint. A big wind factory may have a larger one. Nuclear power may have a fairly small one, but it's larger if you think about the uranium prospecting and all of the systems used to support that. But energy sprawl is that term that's useful to think about that actual physical footprint related to energy production. Does that look beautiful to you?
Yes.
Yes.
To me, it's a horror. It's an absolute nightmare. But in a room like this, some people say that's beautiful. I love that. To me, it is an absolute travesty. And this photo actually is one of the couple of images in the book, in Energy, that got it essentially banned from distribution by one of the national NGOs, one of the conservation groups we thought would be a key partner in distributing it. And they said, thanks, but no thanks. You said mean things about big wind turbines. All right, so if one has a kind of a grasp of these energy literacy principles, Energy 101, it's not difficult to begin sketching out or thinking about the characteristics, the overall quality and characteristics of the current energy economy. That it's centralized, scaled, not for community values, it's really scaled for corporate profit. Primarily, at least in the electricity sector, it's investor-owned utilities, liquid fuels, it's for-profit transnational corporations. It's highly destructive, intrinsically destructive of beauty and biodiversity. And it assumes perpetual growth, which we all know is an impossibility on a finite planet. Nonetheless, it assumes it. It's what it's designed for. And of course, it's anchored by fossil fuels. By the way, that's not photoshopped. That's the state capital of Oklahoma with a working oil derrick in the front yard. So why is this era of extreme energy extraction so dangerous? Well, oh, by the way, and I should give credit, it was Michael Clare who coined this term, extreme energy. I won't give him credit for it. Let's just count the ways. The techno-industrial growth society depends, as we just said, utterly, completely, completely on the availability of super dense, high net energy return, perpetually available, and did I say cheap? Inexpensive fossil energy resources. That's what it's been designed for. Depends on that. So the momentum is there, the trajectory is there. It's also, of course, amoral. The world is simply a resource company. 2, the best of the high-grade stuff is gone, the easiest coal to mine, the easiest oil to drill, the easiest uranium to get. It's been gotten. And so we're moving down into a greater reliance on unconventional and lower-grade hydrocarbon, fossil hydrocarbon resources. When you do that, the area impacts, that is the ecological footprint, generally expands. And the amount of climate change damage also increases. So you've got visual light and visual energy sprawl and visual light expanding even and accelerating even as you move down this trajectory to the lower grade fossil energy resources. Now, I've just mostly talked about fossils through this, but we should be equal opportunity critics. Of course, the same principles apply to renewables as well. You know, mega dams, which really are the largest sector of the renewable energy production, are river pillars. Solar PV generated electricity is terrific, but it has severe limitations, most notably intermittency. It has a fairly low net energy ratio, and if it's sited poorly, like this array, it destroys wildlife habitat. Concentrated solar plants, like this one in California, represent an absolutely huge amount of embodied energy in all that infrastructure, in their construction. They're also scaled to make money for investor-owned utilities, and they're the corporate scale, centralized, not distributed, centralized facilities. And they also destroy natural habitat. Same issues apply also to big wind. Industrial scale wind factories, they are not farms. They are not farms. I don't ever want to hear anybody say that's a wind farm. It is not. They are factories. And where I live in the northern Appalachians, big wind developments are fragmenting wildlife habitat and using the absolute same techniques as your mountaintop removal boys down here. They're using the same techniques and the same explosives to scalp mountains to site this stuff. Is that green power? When it comes to energy, whether we're talking about fossil energy resources or renewables, just like unlike actually in the Beverly Hills areas, there is no such thing as free lunch. Everything has impact. Everything has consequences. So that is just the sort of briefest overview of this new era of extreme energy pictures and energy literacy fundamentals. And this era is clearly one in which we will do anything to sustain the vaunted American way of life. Do you remember when Dick Cheney said American way of life is non-negotiable? You know, not thinking that maybe physics and chemistry actually are a negotiating partners. We'll do anything to make life safe for American suburbia and provide for vital needs like going on vacations along the Las Vegas Strip. Now, we just kind of talked about the energy sector, but that's just one factor in the global eco-social crisis, this great unraveling of the Earth's biological diversity and great loss of place-based indigenous human cultures. We could have spent all this weekend having workshops on how to counter the rapacious damage of industrial forestry, the destruction of forest ecosystems. Or we could have spent all weekend talking about industrial agriculture's energy and chemical intensive practices, or the industrial mindset as applied to livestock production and the spread of CAFOs. Or we could have talked about industrial aquaculture and how the seas are being domesticated to serve human ends and the fouling life that entails. Or industrial recreation that is scarring so many beautiful places, both on private and public lands. We see around us everywhere this culture that doesn't socialize kids to have a reverence for nature. It trains them. It trains the children to think of this place as a resource colony, a setting for fun, enjoyment, a gigantic playground for our toys. We could have spent this weekend talking about how the industrial mindset makes it acceptable to persecute wild creatures, especially large carnivores. How did it come to this? How did we get to this absolute rat's nest of ecological and cultural degradation? Now, really, we would need a lot more time if we were going to go back to the roots of that. It would be fun if we had that time and we could debate whether it was the invention of pastoralism when we first went down that path toward domesticating wild creatures, or when 12,000 years ago we invented agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution. And clearly, more recently, we would blame the Industrial Revolution, the rise of fossil-fueled industrialism. We talk about the contemporary phenomenon of mass consumerism and globalized corporate capitalism. We talk about militarism. We saw a fantastic workshop yesterday about how militarism is affecting the human and natural landscapes of the Southeast. And what about denialism? Is anybody here from Charleston, West Virginia? Is this billboard still up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not photoshopped. It's a real billboard. Clean, carbon neutral coal.
It's clean, man.
It's carbon neutral.
Clean coal kills.
Before it got up and
Denialism.
on the billboard.
Denialism, powerful force, how politicians and the corporations that own them can just lie with impunity. It would be funny if it weren't so positively absurd and tragic to prop up the status quo. Denialism, too, that keeps us not talking about the global overpopulation problem. It's become something of a taboo, even among conservationists. A generation ago, in the 1970s, the American environmental movement talked about overpopulation all the time. We don't anymore. It's largely taboo. And there's been a complete balkanization between groups that work on population issues and those that work on wildlife or land conservation or other kinds of environmental topics. It's like Voldemort. It's the devil that must not be named. And we have an absolutely vapid media culture that keeps it absolutely impossible, it's utterly incapable of addressing root causes. How many days of the news cycle was focused on Miley Cyrus at the video music movies? The root causes. The planet's being cooked. People are getting poor. And there's a global extinction crisis, unprecedented since the dinosaurs went extinct. But we got to focus on her. Bad leadership. And it's not just in the U.S. Bad political leadership, although some countries are far, far ahead. But still, globally, there has been a failure of political leadership around the world to effectively address climate change and the extinction crisis. So that's a whole lot of isms. Industrialism, corporatism, denialism. We listed a bunch of isms. Beyond all of those isms, there's one more ism. What's the fundamental, underneath all of those factors, the idea, the worldview that springs from it, that is at the root of this problem, of this rift between people?
Capitalism.
No, we already mentioned capitalism.
Rugged individualism?
No, not individualism.
Egotism.
No, it's a good ism. It starts with an A. There's a hint. Anybody? Free copy of Energy.
Americanism.
First person who comes up with it. Entering the game
Anarchism?
show. Nobody's coming up with it?
Anthropocentric.
Anthropocentrism. You just won yourself a book, sir. Human-centeredness, this idea that our species is separate from and sovereign over the rest of creation. We are Lord Man. We're the decider, planetary edition. For those of you who are old enough to remember those commercials, you remember this one? This Bud's for you? This Budweiser for you? It's the "this Bud's for you" worldview. you can't remember anthropocentrism, think that this bud's for you. Now, thank goodness the age of the Hummer is over. They're not making the stupid things anymore. But I remember a few years ago.
Seriously, when? We're excited. We didn't know.
Yeah, it's over. They're not making them anymore.
Couldn't make enough
When
money.
they replaced it with the striker.
But a few years ago, I saw a Hummer parked. It's a gigantic SUV with a license plate that really just encapsulated. They had a vanity plate that kind of encapsulated this idea, the world's my oyster. It's all for me. This sense of planetary entitlement. The license plate read, "Living for me." Mr. Hummer gonna living for me. Now, I do have to just make a caveat that it was, I saw this vehicle in Vermont, where I'm from, but it was a New York plate. Everyone in Vermont eats local food and drives a Prius. Absolutely, it's 100% of the population. So, okay, so we've identified the heart of the problem. It's bad idea. Well, what's the antidote to that? What's the antidote? The medicine for the arrogance of humanism.
Direct action.
Well, that is part of it. That's action. But I was thinking more specifically of wildness. Wildness, the humility and restraint that comes from valuing wildness, which is that creative force which produces and sustains biological diversity and which requires space to flourish. What is that space? That space is wilderness, the arena of evolution. There were no, at least I didn't see any workshops here today or this weekend on land conservation, on wilderness protection and oversight. Now, some folks like to argue, there's a whole new academic and strain of thinking that's popping up. Maybe you've heard about the Anthropocene, that we've now entered the age of human dominion. The Anthropocene boosters, some people call them neo-green, some people call them the new environmentalists, some people call them postmodern greens. This whole idea that there's no such thing, they like to attack the idea of wilderness, there's no such thing as pristine wilderness anymore, and therefore, we really just need to get on to the business of managing the planet better. Well, when they say that there's no such thing as no part of the earth that's pristine or utterly untouched by human behavior, of course, I think they're right. How many times does the word pristine appear in the Wilderness Act? That would be 0. How many times does the word virginal appear in the Wilderness Act? 0. That's right, because wilderness is not about being untouched or pristine. It's about being free. The central characteristic of wilderness areas is not virginity. Remember this. It's not virginity. It is freedom. Wilderness is where nature is free. And nature gets to direct the ebb and flow of life. And in America, we have a 150-year-long tradition of protecting lands that are self-willed, parks and wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, nature sanctuaries, we call them all kinds of different things. And the conservation movement that arose to start doing that important work, which was an important social change movement, occurred in response to an earlier environmental crisis, long before we thought about climate change, or even extinction. There was a wave of settlement and deforestation and wildlife loss that had seen the hills of New England just scalped bare and the rivers running brown with silt, that had so littered the prairies with the skulls of bison that it was profitable to go gather them up and ship them back east by train. I was on a shipping yard next to Detroit because they could be ground up into fertilizer. The wing of the conservation movement that came to focus on self-willed lands and the places where self-willed creatures would persist. It actually began, however, with utilitarian arguments, particularly that protected areas would provide scenic beauty, areas of great spectacle, as well as spiritual and recreational renewal for people. And those were later joined, of course, by ecological arguments, scientific biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and all that wilderness areas would help protect those values, biodiversity, and also support natural processes. In the 1920s, Alda Leopold and Arthur Carhart and others, who then were working for the federal government, early conservationists, began to push for designated wilderness areas formerly protected on federal public lands, and primarily initially for recreational purposes, particularly to sustain hunting, fishing, sort of the pioneer skills. In the 1930s, Robert Marshall, advocating for the creation of a new group, a new organization that would fight for wilderness, called the Wilderness Society, he wrote this: "There is just one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. That hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness." Think about that. 1930s. Bob Marshall understood the trajectory of modernity. That civilization had a tyrannical ambition to conquer every niche on the whole earth. Boy, did he have that right. The following decade, later in his life, in his career, Alda Leopold would begin to write about the scientific values of wilderness areas, that they would provide a base datum of normality, so we could begin to understand how healthy land worked, how the land organisms work. And therefore, we would do a better job on the managed landscape as well. The modern wilderness movement articulates, of course, how protected areas are crucial as reservoirs of sequestered carbon, and how they help counter climate change, and how they are absolutely insufficient but absolutely vital to counter the extinction crisis and biodiversity loss. Again, it's useful to remember that all this land conservation that's happening, whether it's a few acres or millions of acres, it's all occurring in that context of a global extinction crisis that is unprecedented in 65 million years. So it's not just about a nice place to hike or go camping or hunt or fish, but about preventing extinction. The ultimate argument, however, the ultimate argument for conserving wilderness is because wild places and creatures simply have a right to exist for their own sake. Regardless of their utility to people, whether we want to see them or we'd like to see them, or whether or not they provide ecosystem services to us, that's irrelevant. They simply have a right to exist for their own sake. And while that intrinsic value argument is certainly much more prominent in the contemporary wilderness movement, it stretches way back, really, to the beginnings of the conservation movement, when into the writings of John Muir and Henry David Thoreau. Freedom and wildness. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is he going to connect this stuff? We've just had a little discourse on American conservation history and wilderness protection and the era of extreme energies. Bear with me. I'm going to get to it. Here's where we're linking up. You see, this idea is actually something new. It's something new under the sun. Because those other really, really important social change movements in American history, whether it's the fight to achieve full civil rights for people of color, or the vote for women, or the abolition of slavery, all of those things, all of those social change movements, essentially were about extending new rights to formerly marginalized categories of people. But the wilderness movement, when it articulates that nature has intrinsic value, that wild places and creatures need to exist for their own sake, and that we need ethical restraint, what it is doing is essentially expanding this sphere of ethical concern to all the members of the land community, not just sticking with one species. And that's a remarkable idea. Expanding the sphere of ethical concern to all the members of the land community, including, if you're in grizzly country, to members of the land community that can eat you. That, of course, would be the worldview of human beings through the vast majority of our history as a species, and would be the worldview of any place-based indigenous person on the planet today. But it is a rather remarkable idea to have arisen from a culture, from a society that historically and currently views the Earth primarily through the lens of economic possibility. What can I get from it? How can I mine it? Can I build a railroad? Can I displace the natives, those pesky indigenous people who are in my way? Who can name this painting?
Manifest Destiny?
Close. American Progress by John Yax, 1865. And it's an amazing, amazing encapsulation of that idea of manifest destiny. That we would, the settlers and the telegraph line get strung and the railroads behind them and the miner and the yeoman farmer, they're all there and they're all being pushed, watched over by the idea of progress and Lady Liberty, who apparently was in rather severe danger of a wardrobe malfunction. This idea of progress. Don't ever let anyone tell you that there's no formal religion, organized national religion in the United States. We have a civil religion. It's the religion of progress. We worship the God of growth. So for the wilderness movement to have arisen in reaction to this is a rather remarkable idea. All right, so what is this connection of these two streams of extreme energy era and this fight to protect wildness? Well, of course, ultimately, it's the same fight. It's ultimately the same fight. But in too many instances, we are letting our anthropocentric frame, I think, actually harm our cause, our ultimate cause, even if we're working incrementally. If we are truly serious about expanding justice and equal rights to all the members of the land community, well, we're going to have to abandon the idea and the lexicon, the language of resourcism, of colonialism. And even as we work maybe incrementally for this policy reform or this law or to win this case, even as we're working incrementally, perhaps we should always be thinking radically, that is, towards systemic change. Because ultimately it may well be possible that you can reform a toxic system to death. Even now, strategically, tactically, it may be unwise to say that sometimes. But we should always probably be thinking it. If in fact the system is fundamentally toxic to nature and people, we should be thinking about killing it. Not just greening it up, but making it die. And replacing it with something far, far better and more durable and more resilient. And we need to remember, when people try to have arguments about what's more important, ecological justice, environmental justice, or protecting wild places and creatures, that these are crazy arguments and nonsensical conflicts that just draw us away from the real work. That ultimately, there is no peace movement, there's no women's movement, there's no Occupy movement, there's no redistribution of inequality on a dead planet. Now, deep systemic change is possible, but only if we imagine it first and then we really work for it. We work for it. And sometimes the answer to a great crisis is a great vision, not incremental reform. The answer to the problem of human slavery was not mitigation. It wasn't better working conditions for slaves. It was abolition of a fundamental wrong, of something that was evil. Enslavement of the living earth is evil. So the answer to the problem of anthropocentrism is this philosophical revolution that replaces an attitude of human dominion with one of communion and reciprocity. So, on to the imagination point. Let's imagine that the wilderness, the contemporary modern American wilderness movement, gets recharged with the energy of the climate crisis movement. And all those young climate change activists who are going to power shift are also not just thinking about chemistry, how many molecules of carbon dioxide are spinning around, and how many wind turbines need to get put up to light their smartphone. but they're actually also thinking about ecology and how wild places can help counter the climate crisis and help end and reverse the extinction crisis. So let's imagine that the more than 1,500 land trusts that are currently in existence in the United States give as much attention in their work to saving wild places as they currently do to farmland protection and timberlands. Let's imagine communities powering down their energy use, building up their reliance on renewable, locally sourced or regionally sourced energy resources, and also help creating green infrastructure, making sure the needs of wildlife aren't forgotten in this fragmented world. Even as we try to keep the lights on in an era of energy depletion and try to keep our larders full, that we're also thinking about the economic vibrance of the non-human communities that surround us. And imagine those local and regional efforts knitting up together to create regional and then even continental scale wildlife movement zones. Wildlife corridors writ large.
Yeah.
And imagine that kind of protection would allow wolves to return to New England. And again, herds of bison would flow across the prairies. And the landscape would be filled with birdsong. You see, it is, who said direct action? Yeah. It is action where we put a biocentric orientation into practice. We simply make a choice in our action, between domesticating nature, doing everything we can to stomp out wildness, to eliminate a self-willed creature, as some researchers have done with this so-called rat bot, literally a remote-controlled rat with electrodes in its brain, or choosing kinship with our fellow members in the land community. See, we make this choice of whether we're going to see the earth as a commodity that we can plunder for profit, or view it as a living community to which we belong. Aldo Leopold wrote, "A thing is right," this famous distillation of the land ethic. "A thing is right when it tends to promote the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." Integrity, stability, and beauty. Beauty, integrity, stability, three things that go together. Beauty matters. Now, as conservation activists in whatever realm, in the legal field, in NGOs, land conservation, against environmental inequality and for justice, for oppressed communities of people and nature, we should always use this perhaps as our test. Even if we're working on an incremental reform, we should ask ourselves, does this really move us toward that? Does it pass the Leopoldian test for an advance to counter either climate crisis or the extinction crisis? And that's the screen, I think, for identifying a false solution from real and substantive change. So my dream is a permanent peace treaty in the war on nature, a permanent peace treaty, rapprochement between people and wild nature, where beauty and wholeness and integrity abounds, and wild creatures and wild places, and wild people, like the ones in this room, would flourish together forevermore. So I began these thoughts with some ancient wisdom, and I appreciate the howl. I began these thoughts with some ancient wisdom from 26 centuries ago. We'll conclude with a voice from this time in this region. Barbara Kingsolver writes,
Yes.
"People need wild places to be surrounded by a singing, mating, howling commotion of other species, all of which love their lives as much as we do ours, and none of which could possibly care less about us in our place. It reminds us that our plans are small and somewhat absurd. It reminds us why, in those cases in which our plans might influence many future generations, we ought to choose carefully. Looking out on a clean plank of planet Earth, we can get shaken right down to the bone by the bronze-eyed possibility of lives that are not our own. Lives that are not our own. I'm really grateful to you. I thank you for the opportunity to have been here with you. And I wish you all, everyone in this room, in whatever realm you are, in every success, in every fight that you are undertaking, on behalf of your clients or your community, and all the lives which may be affected, but which are not unknown. Thank you. Grace, we have a few minutes for...
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions if people want to go over. If you need to go, you actually are still a few minutes late because you started late. So if anyone has questions, if y'all need to go, you can for lunch. But if you have a few questions,
If you're really hungry and you need to zip out, that's fine. But if anybody wants to stay and ask a question or two, that's fine as well. Yes.
With manifest destiny, that term and doctrine being so rooted in Christianity, specifically Catholic doctrine, from the time of European invasion, as some people call it. And this whole issue of Christianity thinking that we're not stewards, but God gave us all this to use. So one of the things you're saying about not being anthropomorphic and centered on us is seemingly contradicted by Christianity in part of its expression in our society, not by everyone. So you're fighting against something that is a deeply held belief that is still taught everywhere in this country. So do you have any ideas about, you can't go in and start a conflict with someone about their religion. I mean, I think that's basically immoral, but is it just changing our own attitudes and starting to talk about this? I mean, how do you suggest that we confront this?
It's very difficult because, as you suggested, the dominant religious tradition in the U.S. and pervasive globally seems to interpret that biblical mandate to have dominion. Now, there are some theologians who have kind of looked at that and say, well, no, we didn't get that quite right. But it is still, as you just suggested, absolutely pervasive. There are some, of course, some Christian scholars and some practicing Christians. I mean, the greatest living prophet in the United States is Wendell Berry, who has written more eloquently than anyone else that I know of about the intersection of a Christian worldview and the absolute mandate to care for the earth. And he comes from that Christian stewardship tradition. And it's brilliant, and I think it's very compelling. He has also argued, in a very strong way, that you don't need to overturn that dominant kind of religious institution, but Christianity needs to clean it up. And there are lots of examples of that happening. Not to put too much happy talk on it, though, you're right. It is a bit of a rub because even if you look at the etymological roots of the word stewardship, what does it mean? It comes from the word of the sty. The steward was the keeper of the pigsty, the domesticated animals outside the colony. So there's a fundamental tension there between stewardship and wildness. It's domestication versus wildness. So it's difficult.
You put a picture of a woman with her hand on a cheetah and about kinship, and I feel it's important, but at the same time you put up Leopold. And how do you resolve that desire to feel that kinship with Leopold's statement and that I remember a time when there was a grizzly beyond every ridge, but now there's a wildlife biologist behind every bush, and our most magnificent mammal retreats further to Canada. And, I appreciate how out of sight, out of mind can often lead to not paying attention to something. And I, for one, didn't appreciate bull trout so much until I caught one in Montana and witnessed it as a beauty, a masterpiece of predatory evolution, not an aesthetically pleasing thing, but seeing it come up and circle a cutthroat trout. How do you resolve that with so few real vestiges of wildness left? The ability to appreciate something and not touch it.
this is maybe the biggest problem with to continue the American conservation ethic as it's evolved over the last 150 years, when less and less young people in particular have access to scraps of wild nature, this phenomenon of nature deficit disorder.
Okay.
As you're in the technosphere, you're less and less in the wild world.
Yep.
If you're the all thumbs generation and you're doing this all the time on the screen, and your only interaction with wildness is a documentary on the Wildlife Channel or the Nature Channel, whatever it's called, and you don't have that visceral connection with a place, even if it's semi-wild, even if it's a scrap of nature, it's very, very difficult to create anything except for a sidewalk, which is what we need.
It's unfortunate that Leopold didn't appreciate that green fire until they watched it die.
It's right, exactly. The famous, that famous incident when you shot the wolf and you watched the wolf die. It is a huge problem. I will say that it's been encouraging since Richard Louv wrote his book, Last Child in the Woods, and coined that term of nature deficit disorder. There's been a whole lot of attention and programs put to getting kids out in wild places, including through the national park system. So there are people that have
There's a lot of what we're doing in Middle Tennessee Group, Sierra Club, or Ames City. I was taking kids that have never even seen a crawdad out.
That is the best stuff, and that is creating ecological literacy. If you can create a tacit, this tactile connection with kids in a place, that's probably some of the most important work that anyone can be doing on Earth. I think you and then you.
Just quick, it's going to sound more like an advertisement. For those who were unaware, there are several places out here. We have like the Earth First Journal. If you don't have $5, you can take them anyway, but they're the journal of the biocentric and radical environmental movement. And if you are unaware of that, they're sitting out here.
A couple of observations. Yeah, that's right. Every one of the national parks, especially in the West, has an institute attached to it that is getting people out in the wilderness. The other thing that we're finding out our way is if you give wildlife the space, it comes back. Bears are coming back. The wolves are coming back. We have packs all over Washington now. As long as we can get people to leave them alone, they've gotten down as far as one wolf got down as far as California. Didn't like it, came back. But it's happening if we give them the space.
I yield the floor to Mr. Ringett.
I'd like to take it to a deeper level, and that's the biological imperative. I've got a nephew who was more or less innocuous until he had a couple of children. And now his attitude is that he will do whatever it takes to foster and to improve the lives of those children. And I think that's inherent in our genetics. And that is that's a more difficult thing to fight than a cultural institution such as religion, because that can be changed. But something that's contained within our DNA, and that is the imperative to have children, to pass on our own genetics. How do you stop that? Right? Your hockey stick graph, and we're at 7.2 billion people, which is unsustainable at its present level, and it's still shooting up. I think the projections now are by 2050 or something like 11 billion.
Yeah. Well, the answer to that is clear. There's a biological imperative. We're mammals. We have something like 500 million years of, sexual reproduction inculcated in our genes. So the desire to reproduce is great. The way you kind of counteract that is that cultural norms are largely determinant of optimal family size. There are societies where the optimal family size is low, and there are societies where it's high. If you give, the classic examples and the standard talking points is if you educate girls, empower women, and provide both mechanisms for reproduction and a safe social place for women to control their own fertility, then you get that demographic transition and fertility rates go way down. The rub here, and this is actually kind of one hopeful thing, is that of all of the problems we've been talking about, unintended pregnancy is the easiest one to solve. The estimates are it would take something like $3.5 billion per year to get universal, globalized, modern means of family planning to everyone who wants it. $3.5 billion, it's probably what the Pentagon spends on Doritos. It's nothing. It's nothing. And if you also bracket that, which is give the mechanisms for family planning with those other things like universal literacy for girls, empowering women to make their own economic decisions, and you use popular media, particularly radio novellas and population media center has been so successful working in more than 30 countries in the developing world, trying to create new cultural norms for family size through radio and television novellas, then things work. It really does work. That's a solvable one. So there was here, here, and then
a couple of things I wanted to talk about is, first of all, I want to be very careful when we're talking about these issues, especially in a group like this, about the inherent classism, about, and I'm not saying it necessarily as a criticism overall, but just to say being aware of the privilege that we have just from the money to be able to go to wild places. I mean, there's a lot of people who can't afford it. And with that poverty comes a different viewpoint, a different worldview that, you've got to start looking at how are you going to approach that as a poverty issue rather than just well, you're bad because you're anthropomorphic centric. So we need to start shifting the way we're looking at it in order to start asking other people to shift the way they look at it.
good point and well taken. And I hope I didn't give the idea that the only way to experience wildness is to, fly out to the Grand Canyon or go, hang out in Yosemite. It's not. What I'm talking about when I think about flourishing human communities embedded in a matrix of wild nature and sustainable steady state economics, kind of based on the local and regional networks of resource production, is a landscape where there are wild places everywhere, not far away, for the rich people to go to. And we actually have a strong basis for that already in our state parks and federal public lands. There are Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, national forests, BLM lands. There's this huge, huge reservoir of public land already that's close to large population centers. Now, what is interesting is that the inner city demographic has been totally underserved. And Trust for Public Land has really been good about trying to rectify that. Because it needs to be broadly accessible to every socioeconomic class.
I have a couple more things I want to add, because I'm sorry we were supposed to announce this and we've not been able to find time, so thank you. There's been a huge win in the Pacific Northwest. The State Department of Ecology has ruled that we have to consider climate change for a coal terminal that was proposed for just north of Bellingham, Washington, which is where we're from, for a coal terminal that was proposed at a place called Cherry Point. So climate change has actually gotten a huge win. It's the first time climate change has ever been required to be studied in an EIS. This was due to, we got 125,000 comments in the scoping period. Normally, if you get 5,000 comments, you're doing really, really good. We had 125,000. So if you want to take a look at a couple of websites, you can look at powerpastcoal.org, has a news release on it. The American Petroleum Institute has already put out a news release talking about how they're going to fight this, the legal challenges that they want to mount to this. So if anyone's interested in helping us in the Northwest in responding to their legal challenges, we would really dearly love it.
Yeah, and it's climate change from the point of mining to the point of burning and blowback.
It's
the
whole
process.
It's the blowback from Asia has to be included in the EIS.
Wow,
it's
that's
a miracle.
great.
Two things. One, just in passing, my hometown, you're going to urban areas. Philadelphia has a 12 square mile park that goes to the north. I grew up taking that for granted, but I lived in the motor city for a while. Second thing is that you mentioned the population growth. You don't hear about it, and it's, you have to. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is that we're really a species in overshoot.
Absolutely.
And if nothing else, just a shortage of water is going to cause a massive dollar.
Right, we're in massive overshoot. I mean, the one thing we know about being in an unsustainable situation is that it won't be sustained.
Quick comment, this is a lady here. South Knoxville has several hundred acres and growing of an urban wilderness.
Right.
Is that through Fish and Wildlife, Urban Refuge?
It's a whole bunch of stuff. The city is basically behind it.
Fish and Wildlife Service has a new Urban Wildlife Refuge priority, and that's something I think developers should be looking at.
One more, Commissioner Freeman.
Since most energies, whether renewable or non-renewable, exploit the land, how do you respond, how do I support not condoning mountaintop removal, and then respond to the question, then what energy source should be used?
Yeah, it is a good question. The first answer that I would make to that is always begin with conservation. The best watt is the negawatt, the one that wasn't needed. Amory Lovins talks about drilling in a Detroit formation. You know, if you radically increase energy efficiency, you use less. So again, you know, the happy lining, I presented a whole lot of really negative stuff there. One of the bright sides of the fact that we're such a wasteful, profitable society is that there's so much opportunity to do better. Americans, you know, use about twice as much energy per capita as Western Europeans. Well, they're not living in caves in Paris, and I've been told the food's really good. I've never been there, but you know, we waste so much. So there are tremendous opportunities for conservation and efficiency first. And then we should be looking always at turning the characteristics of the current energy economy on their head. So if it's centralized and corporate profit and anchored by fossil fuels, then we should be thinking about a future energy economy that is, you know, is based on supporting a steady state economy, not perpetual growth, that supports beauty and biodiversity, and that is community scale and distributed, not centralized. That's the energy economy of the future, and that's already happening. You're already seeing lots of pushback from large investor-owned utilities who see their business model collapsing. The more solar PV arrays that are on people's roofs, and the more businesses that are generating their own power, means less customers for that centralized grid service utility. And the fact that they're already getting scared about it is really encouraging. So I would say always start conservation and efficiency. There is going to be a place for large-scale wind, but if it is sited poorly on the mountaintops of New England, where I live, it's being sited on mid-elevation ridgelines, the last strongholds of wild nature, the last best places for wildlife habitat. That's where it's going in, and it's going in for corporate profit, not to support community.